and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
This week, we're pleased to be joined by historian and broadcaster David Olusoga. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
David is a professor of public history at the University of Manchester, the host of the BBC history series A House Through Time, and now the co-host of Journey Through Time, a new social history podcast that sounds completely fascinating. But yeah, welcome, David.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We'll ask you a little bit more about your podcast and what you're trying to do with it later. But first of all, we wanted to talk about, we've got a kind of climate of censorship in universities at the moment, particularly in the States. Universities seem to be under attack by the government in America, federal funding cuts, students targeted for political speech. Columbia University is one that kind of comes to mind the most. You're a part-time academic, you told us before we started, but tell us a little bit about what it's like in academia right now. And does it feel like history as a sort of discipline is under attack?
Well, I think the situation in British universities is not one of government suppression or of censorship. It is of a looming financial crisis. It is a model that has been encouraged by successive governments of universities becoming more global, reaching out to having greater numbers of foreign students, building their futures, building their economic planning and in some cases, their building projects, physical building construction projects on this pipeline of foreign students. And while there have been some great successes, while this has, I think, been a great example of British soft power, it now looks like a very dangerous business model. So the conversations I have with colleagues and friends in academia, the big concern is the future of British universities. It's whether or not in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we might even see a British university become financially unviable. We might see a university go down, go bust, which is just a horrific idea, horrific for staff, for academics, but in particular for students. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happening in America is worrying and distinct, but I don't think it is at the forefront of the mind of scholars and academics in the UK, because we have our own domestic and in a very different way, very serious problem.
There was a letter that's come out now from the Columbia History Department talking about the Trump administration's efforts to sort of, hurt the university or silence the university. And they write in this letter, should this control of the government be realized here or elsewhere, it would make any real historical scholarship, teaching and intellectual community impossible. That's not the situation, as you say, in the UK. But when you look at that, do you, as somebody who kind of has dedicated their career to history, do you fear for the future of history when you see those sorts of movements, or do you feel like, well, that's a very particular case over there, and actually historians are sort of strong enough to stop it, as it were?
I think what it feels like to me is that the Trump 2.0 has picked up exactly where the previous administration ended. One of the last acts of the first Trump administration, a phrase I hoped I'd never say, was the 1776 report. Which was a response to the 1619 report by the New York Times that advocated history as what it called a patriotic education, not scholarly inquiry, but patriotic education. It argued that race and racial tensions in America were in part caused by the teaching of history rather than by the consequences of those 300, 400 years of history. And I mean, that phrase, patriotic education, that is totalitarian. That is the sort of thing I would have associated growing up when I was being told at school that I was lucky, as I was, to be on the right side of the Iron Curtain. So that was the last attack on history by the previous Trump administration. So it doesn't surprise me in the least that this is where they've picked up. And history is a particular target. History is it's been more under political attack than any time, well, in the West's history, for many decades, and it's not surprising because history is offering a far more critical, far more holistic view of our nations that asks us to do something different to patriotism. It's asking us to have self-reflection. It's asking us to recognize that parts of our past, whether it's Britain, America, France, whoever, that can't just be celebrated, that history cannot just be this endless pageant of heroes and victories and inventions and wonderful things to get all warm and fluffy inside about. If you are trying to also rule by confecting divisions, I think historians do make useful bogeymen. These people who are awkward, who are bringing up these uncomfortable parts of the past, I think we are useful targets. And I think you can see that in the United States. I think you can somewhat see that in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, just come back to the crisis in UK universities, and you talked about the kind of structural funding issues, the cuts, the risk of universities here going bust. There are political choices in this context, because we see universities deciding which departments to keep open, where to make those cuts. How influenced do you think university management are when they're making those decisions by the kind of wider discourse around those kind of issues you've talked about the kind of uncomfortable elements of British history and the debates that we've had, now for the past few years around the empire and race and the historical errors and injustices perpetrated by the UK? That must feed into those decisions now, don't you think?
I think probably in a very small way, but I think there are much bigger issues that feed into the calculations universities make about which courses to expand, which courses to withdraw or pull away from. And I think the problem with culture warriors is that they're sort of high on their own supply. They think that they're having a far greater influence than they are. Far more practical issues, such as our debate about immigration and visas and student visas in particular, I think is a bigger issue. The value for money of a British degree compared to degrees in other countries, the choices being made by students from China and other countries about whether to go to Britain or the United States or somewhere else. Economic fluctuations in the economies of other countries. I mean, the great hope for many universities just a few years ago was supposed to be Nigerian students. Well, the level of inflation and the decline of the naira means that the number of Nigerian students is dropping. So I think there are all of these practical issues. The bigger issue when it comes to subject, I don't think it's got anything to do with culture wars or people studying empire, because there's not that many people. Most people studying history aren't studying the empire. They're studying something else. I think the bigger issue is universities as businesses. And we've, as a society, pushed this idea of universities as businesses and degrees as being utilitarian tickets towards a social selection. And on top of that, young people themselves, when you're making a decision about a degree course that could put you 40, 50, 60,000 pounds in debt, what job you're going to get at the end of it becomes vital. So you have a combination of government saying some subjects are non-vocational, they won't help you get a job, and students having to make decisions about what is the obvious thing I can do with this degree. And what that has led to, combined with other factors, is a decline of humanities. And I think that is far bigger than any concerns about empire or slavery or the other sort of things that people like me talk about.
You recently gave a speech at the School of Advanced Studies about the future of the humanities, and you mentioned there a film that sort of changed your life when you were a student and your career. It's called The War That Never Ends.
Yeah.
About the Gulf War and Thucydides. And one thing that I thought was really interesting about that is the role of public service broadcasting in telling stories about history. That's something that you've dedicated your life to. You're now also telling stories about history through this new forum, which is podcast, as we're on now, and your new one. I'm interested to know about what role you think podcasts now play in this public service of telling people about history that maybe public service broadcasting is now less able to do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'd like to think public service broadcasting can still do it. The documentary you're talking about, I think, is one of the great moments of public service, one of the moments that I think we should be proud of. It's a BBC moment, and I've spent a lot of my life working for the BBC, and I'm very proud to have done so. And it was a moment on the eve of the Gulf War that the BBC dramatised sequences of the negotiations that are part of Thucydides' great work on the Peloponnesian Wars. And it was not a new idea. It had been done on stage before, but what it did was it showed the timelessness of human conflict. The debates and the diplomatic envoys being sent back and forth was exactly what we had all watched as the world pushed closer to what we then called the Gulf War. We now sadly call the second Gulf War. Sorry, the first Gulf War. And it was just remarkable. I mean, the cast included Ben Kingsley. It was just brilliant. And I was a teenager, and that was it. I just wanted to do history. But I wanted to do public history because that was the great example in my life of how powerful it was. Probably shouldn't say this, but it's on YouTube, as everything is. And it's just brilliant. And it was television. It was programs like that. It was watching the documentaries of Michael Wood that made me want to be an historian. And the thing that public service broadcasting, I think podcasts also can do, is they can inspire in people passions and interests that last a lifetime. I'm here 30 years after that documentary on BBC Two, having spent my life making history programs and writing history books because of the things that I watched as a kid, sat in the Council of State on the Northeast. There are people who I've met who've listened to podcasts or who've read books or who've watched television programs who've then gone on to study, to do PhDs. I've met people, and this is incredibly humbling, I've met people who've been inspired to do PhDs because of reading my books. That capacity of public humanities to fill people's lives with a richness that is a sort of lifelong passion, as exactly happened to me, is just such an incredibly humbling, thing to be near. It is, I'm often kind of, really in awe of the power of mediums that can reach people in their private moments and tell them stories and inspire interests. And they go out and they buy books or they study courses or they go to talks. And it's enriching. I made a series for the BBC a few years ago, Civilizations, that was a follow-up to the great Kenneth Clark series, Civilization. And I spoke to lots of people who had watched Civilization when they were young in the 60s, 70s when it was out and then repeated. And it had been life-changing. They had spent their life going to art galleries, collecting art, reading art books because of Kenneth Clark in front of a fresco in Italy on BBC Two. So it is.
Do you think the BBC still has that impact and is still able to create shows with that kind of legacy?
Well, I think it does. I mean, the most humbling thing that, sorry to be self-obsessed and talk about myself, but the show I make for the BBC, House Through Time, I get regularly sent house histories that people have self-published because they've been inspired by that program. When I go to archives, the archivists often tell me that there is an increase in footfall of people studying their house after every series of House Through Time. So you can see, I can see in my post bag, I can see in the conversations I have that a lot more happens after a program has been broadcast than you might imagine. Its impacts at the personal level can be far, far more dramatic than you might imagine.
It's amazing. And now you've got this new podcast with Sarah Churchwell, Journey Through Time, and you're looking at the past from the bottom up, like a house through time. So you've got the stories of regular people and how they shape an era. And of course, now we're living at a time where we've got these big, powerful figures, in the news all the time. We've got Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Zelensky, and the people talk about the great man theory of history. Is it these individuals shaping things? But of course, the approach of your podcast is slightly different. Do you think that when people, if you think about you as a historian looking back at this time, what do you think are the sort of trends of sort of more ordinary people that historians will be kind of talking about later on?
I think that one of the weaknesses of that form of history that emerged with Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s, that history was just the biographies of great men, was that even if you believe that, the impact of those great men is still a social history. There are still millions of people who are affected by those great men. You might think the story of the late 18th and early 19th century is really the story of Napoleon and Wellington, but it's also the story of the millions who served in the Grande Armée and the other armies that fought on those battlefields. It's about the communities that sent them off to war. It's about the communities that produced the weapons. It's about the economic effect. It's about how those wars spilt out into global wars that affected people in different continents. So the questioning and the expansion of history to more social history forms is not to say that great men, or I think we should call them great men, influential figures perhaps.
Might not be fitting for some of the people we're talking about.
Somewhat loaded term. It's not to say that individuals cannot have a huge impact on history. I mean, anyone who studies the 20th century, take away Stalin, take away Hitler, that is a different century. It would be ridiculous to say that influential individuals cannot be astonishingly powerful. But even when they are, those wars, those depressions, those revolutions, they are engaged in by millions of individuals. It leaves a social history behind.
But if you imagine yourself kind of looking back at this period as a historian in the future, what do you think are the things that kind of those social trends may be personified by some of those influential figures? What are the things that historians do you think are going to be kind of pulling out as the things that led to this moment? Maybe that's an impossible question to answer. I don't know.
Well, I've got my pessimistic take. I mean,
that's fine. You might look at pessimism.
The books I've written and say I probably mainly offer a pessimistic take. I think we're at one of history's hinge moments. I've lived my life, and you lived your lives, basically in the shadow of the Second World War and in the institutions and the ethos that emerged from that post-war mindset, that post-war generation. And I think that ended a few weeks ago. The pieces of the kaleidoscope are in flux. I don't think we know what the next phase looks like, but we're no longer in the post-war world.
Did it end in
my life?
Did it end in that? Are you referring to the White House meeting with Zelensky, particularly when it ended, or just generally?
Well, I think it is future generations of historians who will be able to identify what that exact moment was. It could have been J.D. Vance's visit to Munich. It could have been the Zelensky Oval Office event. I think future historians should be left to make that judgment. And we don't know, and it may be an event that hasn't happened yet. But I think it is very difficult to see this as a bump in the road of the business as usual post-war consensus with the post-war institutions in place and still healthy and still operating. This is, I think, a profound rupture from which a new era will emerge, and we have no way of knowing what that new era will be like. So I do think this is going to be one of the most studied periods in history. And, to live in interesting times is a curse, not not wishing you well.
I mean, the tools of these future historians will be the archives of information that we are creating and storing now, and that also protecting now. In the US government has been deleting information from websites. There's concerns that more information will go missing. Things like, missing Ukrainian children, climate research, anything that doesn't align with kind of the politics of the US administration. So in this digital age where so much of the work of government now is digital, so much of our collective archive has been accessible because it's digital, and now that's being removed. What do you think that means for historical research? What are your worries about the integrity of archives in existence now, what should be being created now, given what we're seeing in America?
The spectacle of a democratic government destroying knowledge is something that reinforces my view that we're living in a period that is at the end of the post-war era, that is unlike those decades. It's something I thought I'd never see, and I think it's something profoundly dangerous and profoundly anti-democratic. And it is a crisis for historians, but I also think it's a crisis immediately. It's a crisis because that information had a function. That information, in many cases, was information we needed to advance in the future, not just to have this moment stored in the past. But I think there are other challenges. The amount of political debate that takes place on WhatsApp is astonishing.
And the government on WhatsApp.
The government on WhatsApp, people strangely losing their phones or forgetting passwords, the auto-deletion function, people suddenly accidentally losing thousands of messages, the fact that we've had great political events like Brexit partly taking place in on a platform that is not stored, rather than things being recorded in government papers. They're just, even before what's happening in America had begun, there is an issue about how well imprinted in the official record are the politics of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Why are we so bad, or why is government so bad at kind of harnessing those digital archives? Is there a lack of knowledge, a lack of will? Can that situation be improved?
Well, it could be improved by not allowing people to use private means of communication to discuss government business. But then the question is, what's government business and what's party business? That's always going to be a very controversial and somewhat opaque distinction.
You talked just now about us living through this this major historical moment, this curse that we're living through right now. And in a recent kind of historical moment, the pandemic, we had this this sense that we suddenly were listening to scientists, appreciating scientists. It's kind of this kind of public experts were a guide for all sorts of people who are trying to make their way through the muddle of the pandemic, and we're now in another kind of crisis, as you outlined, where there's a role for public historians, so people like Tim Snyder, for example, to help people kind of understand what's happening. What is their role exactly of a kind of historian in the moment, going through a period which will be in the future such a major point in history?
Yeah. I mean, to talk about the pandemic for a second, here's an historical event from which we've decided to take exactly the wrong lessons. The lessons of the pandemic are that everything is global, that government needs to be, and society needs to be better integrated rather than separate, that the challenges of the future, whether it's pandemics or whether it's climate change, don't respect or recognize borders. And that our great weapon is science. The RNA vaccines are the modern miracle. That's the reason why we can talk about the pandemic in the past tense. We've decided to draw exactly the opposite, exactly the wrong lessons from the pandemic. And I think if we can draw the wrong lessons from a historic event like that, then our capacity to draw the wrong lessons from this political moment are already proven. I'm not quite sure what the role of historians are in this moment, other than it's to do what Tim Snyder's doing. And I think he's the most important historian in the world at the moment. I urge everyone to read his Substack and to listen to him on whenever he's on YouTube or on US television. He's on UK podcasts. He writes in British newspapers from time to time. I think he's by far the most important historian in the world. I think in some ways he's holding the burden of how we should think about history as a tool to understand what's happening to us, and that is I could describe the sort of job description, but I think the reality is it's what Tim Snyder's doing, who is reminding us almost daily that we need history, we need precedent, we need context to understand what is happening, and in some cases what is being done to us. And he's doing it brilliantly and powerfully. But I think Heather Cox Richardson, I think, is similarly become a voice that's emerged from an academic framing to become a part of the lives of millions of Americans, I think, in a way that's really impressive. And I think she's a brilliant scholar. I'd also say Sarah Churchwell, my co-host, who's written about the origins of America First as a slogan and as a political ideology. Tim Snyder's often referenced Sarah's work. I think these scholars are critical to helping us understand, because we can't understand this moment without understanding how we got here.
Just thinking a bit about some of your recent work, kind of bringing issues into the mainstream and making people aware of historical context that they wouldn't otherwise been aware of, in the way that Tim Snyder does, Heather Cox Richardson does, talking about American legal history as well. I mean, your book, Black and British, which is also a documentary, did take this subject into the mainstream and was part of a really national conversation then about race in Britain. And so when we think about the role of a public historian, reflecting on that body of work, how much difference do you think this nationwide conversation actually had in, for example, the teaching in schools, what kids learn, what's your feeling looking back on that work and on the conversation that we all shared about the impact and where we've maybe got to or not?
Well, I'm going to use a word that I used earlier, but humbled. I mean, I'm very humbled to look at the books that I've written and the impact they've had, and I'm constantly, people are coming up to me with copies that are kind of well worn to be signed. And in my experience, I'm sure there are people who are more organized than me. I try to survive the writing of a book rather than thinking about what's going to happen to it once it's published. It's such a difficult process that at the end of it, I have no sense of future other than needing more sleep. So watching books interact with society, and sometimes in some cases with the moment, is a kind of astonishing experience. I'd like to think that some of the books that I've written and the TV programs that I've made have done something which I think is really, really important, which is they've normalized parts of the British story that had been framed as if they were external, as if they were optional extras, that they were kind of these sort of difficult bits that didn't quite fit in the rest of the jigsaw. Just trying to say that the story of empire, the story of slavery, the story of the non-white presence in Britain going back centuries is just a normal part of the story. That act of normalization, I think if there's anything I'd like to think my books have achieved, it's just that. Quite a small ambition, but I think it is an important thing.
Yeah.
Do you envisage at some point, kind of within our lifetimes, that kind of British school children will really learn about the history of empire? That it'll become something that's kind of properly learned at schools among even younger kids?
I think the demographics make that, it's people used to say not long ago about America that demographics was destiny, and America was bound to become a more liberal, inclusive society because of it was going to become a majority-minority society. And we are where we are. So it's a dangerous idea that lazily you can just follow demographics and lovely things will happen. But the demographics of this country do suggest that this generation who is in school at the moment, that they are so diverse and so integrated that to them having a history that doesn't include the empire will just not make any sense. We're heading towards a country where 29-30% of the population will be mixed or from an ethnic minority by sometime around the middle of the century. And of course, every sort of interracial relationship, every mixed race marriage, every interracial friendship group is a bigger group of people. That if you're a kid, particularly in this city, in London at the moment, if you want to make sense of this city, you want to make sense of your class, of your community, of the football team that you follow, of the musicians that you like, the artists that you follow, without the story of the empire, why it all looks the way it does, why they have the names that they do, where they came from, how we all came to be here together. It doesn't make any sense. The England football team doesn't make any sense. Stormzy doesn't make any sense. The Mobos don't make any sense. The Mercury Hordes don't make any sense, because this is just the mechanism by which we all came to be together on these islands. I'm a Nigerian Geordie. That needs some explanation. There is a story there to allow for the existence of Nigerian Geordies. And that story is an imperial story. So again, to that idea of normalization, it's just, we cannot understand one another. We cannot call for people to come together and to integrate unless we understand each other's stories. And I think that's true about class as well. I think it's true about our relationship with Ireland as well as our relationship with India, Africa, the Caribbean. We are a remarkably global nation. The big question about Britain is, how did this small island off the coast of Europe create the biggest empire the world's ever seen? It's got to be the biggest question about this country, the biggest paradox. And it shaped us. It shaped how the rest of the world sees us. It shaped our language, our culture, and our demographics. Very late in the day, it changed our demographics. But we are a nation that is a product of that story, not only of that story, obviously lots of other stories. But without that piece of the jigsaw, I don't think you can make sense of Britain as it is in the 21st century. And the experiences I have with this generation, they don't see it as a taboo subject. They've always been open to it. So they don't think, oh, here's this alien narrative that's, might make me feel guilty or something like that. It's just part of history. And those ideas, those lazy culture war ideas about guilt and pride and shame, I just don't meet young people who think in those terms. And they are ridiculous sentiments with which to engage with history.
Yeah, they're curious about it. I mean, the way that you talk about history, it feels like such a kind of essential, central kind of part of life and of public life.
And it shouldn't be controversial. And,
right.
And what is controversial and what is political is really interesting. I talk, and I've written, and I've made programs about my Scottish ancestors. My family came from the fields outside Tranent, a village outside Edinburgh, tilled the fields for generations in abject poverty. When I go up to Edinburgh, I drive up a country lane and I stand outside the cottages in which they lived, and I looked out at the fields in which my ancestors, the Ewits of Tranent, that they tilled those fields with horses. When I write about them and their poverty, no one says that's political. The moment I mention my Nigerian ancestors, suddenly it's political. The moment it's my ancestors whose encounter with Britain was colonial, though many people would say that Scotland's relationship with Britain is colonial. I personally wouldn't, but some people would. Suddenly it's political. Political is a code word in that context for uncomfortable. That people, these are just ways of asking people who are talking about things they're uncomfortable with, particularly non-white people, to sit at the back and be quiet. That's what people really mean, is this makes me feel uncomfortable. Please stop talking about it. And we don't want particularly brown and black people talking about these histories, because you should be in the back, not making a fuss, being grateful for being in Britain.
I guess the future of these conversations, if there are younger generations that feel less uncomfortable with asking those questions and examining those subjects, and maybe that's because it's their stories. So they're closer to these tales. Everyone's interested in their own stories, the stories of where they came from.
But they've never known another world. People call this generation like digital natives. They're also kind of diversity natives. They've always known a Britain that looked like this. It is the sort of imagined 1950s England that people imagine they want to get back to. They can't even conceive of it. They've always lived in this cultural and demographic diversity. So it is natural to them. So therefore, a history that speaks to that and explains that is equally natural and normal. And that thing, I guess that's why I value that idea of making these histories just normal.
Yeah. We started with history under attack, and we've reached a point that feels like quite a positive, actually, outlook on the future of history. One question that we like to ask our guests on the podcast is about their optimism for the world in which we live. How optimistic are you about the future of the humanities, and what would kind of give you hope right now?
I think the humanities are in a dangerous place because, I think the humanities are in a dangerous place because there's a risk we fall into the Oscar Wilde quote of seeing the price of everything and the value of nothing. That it takes a greater leap of imagination, despite all of the case studies out there, to understand what a history of art degree or a philosophy degree does. Then you look at people in leadership positions. You look at people who are the center of our economy, bringing in income and creating innovation, and they've very often got those humanities degrees. But that simplistic idea that an engineering degree is by its nature a better degree because it has a clear pathway to a career is such a simplistic and lazy way of thinking. And it's been pushed by certain politicians and certain newspapers because it's an easy, lazy culture war story. And the example I'm always fond of is that what is defined as a Mickey Mouse degree. It's anything that sounds like it might be fun, basically. And the great example for me is that there are stories from many years ago now ridiculing the idea that there was a degree in games design at the University of Dundee. Well, as a result of that courses and other interventions, Dundee's become one of the global centres of the computer game industry, which is an industry that's bigger than the music industry, is the size of the film industry. That sector's booming in Dundee, partly because of the universities getting involved in that subject. And yet the lazy culture war headline of Mickey Mouse degrees that picked out something which has been probably brought more tax income into the country than anything that I've ever studied for sure. we're badly served by people who don't really care about universities, don't really care about the subjects that are taught at universities, but do care about trying to sell newspapers.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thank you so much for joining our podcast. We look forward to listening to your new podcast.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.